Hi, my name's Carl Wilkins with World Outside My Shoes, and my wife and I moved to Rwanda in 1990. We lived there for 6 years. I was doing humanitarian work with the Adventist Development Relief Agency, and we were there with our 3 young children. I'm going to try to give you a brief background on Rwanda. Kind of ridiculous to do what I'm attempting to do because it's such a huge and complex story, but just as an introduction, I want to just share a brief background, not hugely academic in terms of accuracy and figures, but as someone who lived there, friends with Rwandans, this is kind of the general story that I often heard and have pieced together over the years. The Germans coming to Rwanda in the late 1800s after World War I, everything Germany had been part of taken away. The Belgians are kind of given Rwanda, if you can give a country to anybody. And as the Belgians are there, they find 3 groups of people actually, but 2 groups, a group that call themselves Tutsis. In fact, they find a king who is a Tutsi, a group who call themselves Hutus, and another, which is the majority group, and another group who call themselves Twa. A small minority, really doesn't mix much with the others, stay to themselves, more hunter-gatherers, whereas people who had a Tutsi background, more cattle people, people who had a Hutu background, more agricultural people. And so the Belgians, and they're trying to figure things out, they introduce identity cards where they think it's important to include in this card not just simply an identity for like a driver's license purposes, but designating who is who. And unfortunately, so many times when we're designating who is who, there's this higher and lower things that get introduced into the system. And so basically for about 40 years, the Belgians, not surprisingly, finding a Tutsi king and other Tutsi chiefs, they were maybe 10–15% of the population, somewhere in the middle. Hutus, maybe 85 or more percent of the population. But they gave the privilege, is the way the story's told, to many of the Tutsi people, whether it was privilege in government, whether it was privilege in business, whether it was privilege in church, the Catholic Church being really huge influence there during those years. And, for a lot of people, though, during that time, I'm told their idea wouldn't be so much I'm a Hut or I'm a Tutsi, but they're most people subsistence farmers. They're out in the countryside. They would simply say, we're poor, that's who we are, more important than Hutu or Tutsi, we're poor. And in our poverty, they're working together to get their kids in school, keep a roof over their head, feed their families like anybody anywhere in the world would be wanting to do. And so as a result as well, they married each other. It didn't matter if one ID card or another. You would find people marrying with different ID cards by the thousands, Sadly, the discrimination against people with a Hutu ID card continued on and on until finally they'd had enough. Late 50s, 60s, there's violence, there's talk of a revolution. Many Hutu people who had studied in Europe or maybe some other French-speaking countries and stuff came back. And unfortunately, with this violence, with the change of power that was coming, violence came along. Many people with Tutsi ID cards were killed. Many fled the country. Some stayed and survived those massacres. And a new government was established in 1962. And sadly, instead of saying, okay, we know discrimination. We've had discrimination for the last 40 years, We're going to build a new country that is Rwandan, that is not about discrimination at all, but it's about us as a country. What can we do best for our country? No, they tended to build the new government, as I'm told by my friends, on Hutu power. This whole idea that the Tutsis, you had your turn before, now it's our turn. And so that your turn, our turn, is part that's adding up to many other things that it eventually will contribute to the, I hate to use the word success, but of the genocide years later in 1994. So in any case, this Hutu power continues on through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and I'm skipping a lot here because I'm trying to keep this brief, but finally in 1990, 6 months after my wife and I moved to Rwanda, the country is attacked from the north. Who is it? Well, it's predominantly the Tutsi people who had fled 30 years earlier, 1959, 1960, 61. And they were not allowed back in the country. Basically, they weren't allowed back in the country for all of those years. Finally, they got military training in Uganda, they got their guns, and they said, we're coming back. And so the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF as they were known, attacked the country. There was a 3-year war that followed. They gained some ground in the country, and won't go into the details of the war except to say that finally in August '93, an agreement was hammered out. In the meantime, during those, an agreement hammered out between the existing government, the other political parties in the country, and the Rwandan Patriotic Front. During the course of the war, the international community had pressured Rwanda to have more political parties. We're not going to keep sending funds or supporting work in Rwanda for a one-party state was the message that was given. So almost overnight during this 3-year war, we got many other political parties. And Rwanda wasn't just technically divided with an ID card, but there was feelings of the North and South that sometimes were not so, lost love between the two groups. And in any case, they got most everybody to a negotiating table. I say most everybody because there was a small group, a political party, an extremist party called the Coalition for the Defense of the Republic, CDR, who didn't make it, I'm told, to the negotiating tables in Tanzania, where the Arusha Accord was hammered out. And that was actually the group of people, it turns out, who kind of hatched and incubated and then carried out the genocide that was launched when the president's plane was shot down. You see, in August they had the agreement, which meant that in December we're supposed to have a new broad-based transitional government, BBTG, where everybody would be represented. But these extremists, especially captured in the CDR, were saying, no, we will never share power. To share power is worse than defeat. And so they are the ones that, as I said, were behind this genocide. It was very politically driven. Some people want to say, oh no, Hutu people hated Tutsi people, got so hot that, it exploded into genocide, or Tutsi people hated Hutu people, explode. No, it's really not about hatred between two groups, because if it was, why did they marry each other by the thousands? And many times people say, well, okay, if they married each other so much, how could you get neighbor to kill neighbor? And these are all questions that need to be discussed coming out of the study of Rwanda. But the one little part I'll interject there, and then we'll move on to the last part of the history, at least ending with 1994, is that it doesn't take, I don't believe it takes much bigotry. I don't think it takes much prejudice, much hatred to spoil a whole community, a whole country, like a cancer. In any case, the new government was not launched in December '93, delayed January, February, March. April, the president flies out of the country to have these talks again to try to get this new government launched. And as he's flying back in, coming into the airport, probably about 8 miles, 5 miles maybe from our house, we hear this explosion. We don't know what it is, but find out within an hour that it's the president's plane, and the president of Rwanda and Burundi have been killed along with everybody else in the plane, and thus launches the genocide. Genocide in many ways is so effective because the planners were able to construct an enemy. I don't believe that enemies are born. In fact, nobody can convince me that enemies are born. Enemies are constructed. And the government used radio to construct the enemy. I mean, I was talking to some 9th graders the other day, and I said, guys, how would you construct an enemy? And one of the kids says, well, you talk bad about them. I'm like, yeah. Someone else says, you wouldn't let your kids play with their kids. I'm like, yeah, you guys have the idea. This construction process of constructing an enemy was going on for quite a while in Rwanda. And they used the national radio hugely, along with some other means, the education system and other areas, the discrimination. So it wasn't really hard to convince a lot of people, hey, the guys with the guns, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, they're the enemy. And anybody in the country who has a Tutsi ID card, they're the enemy. Anybody who married to a Tutsi person, they're the enemy. And any Hutus who are moderate, not going along with this, they're the enemy. And so thus you have this formula that the things coming together, and it's a lot more complex than what I've outlined, but the setting for the genocide. I think I'll just end with the idea that if we believe that enemies are constructed, we should be able to believe that enemies can be deconstructed. And people say, well, okay, that sounds good, but how? And the two tools that I'm really excited about that I think are extremely that you can really make a difference in terms of deconstructing an enemy. Okay, I'm gonna have to pause. My screen went dead. We'll pick this up in a moment here. EOI76. Yeah, we're not still recording. Maybe we are. Oh, we are still recording. Okay. So let me pick this up one more time here. That if we believe that enemies are constructed, then we should be able to believe that enemies can be deconstructed. And how would we deconstruct an enemy? The two tools that I think are most important in this process are the power of stories and service. Stories have a way of inspiring service. Service has a way of empowering stories. So when we look at a situation, whether it's as complex as something in the Middle East or whether it's as simple but annoying as somebody stealing your parking space, we need to learn the story. We need to often learn the backstory behind. And as we learn those stories, hopefully it will inspire us to action. It will inform us so that our action will be effective too and not making things worse. And that action, I think, should take the shape of partnerships and not somebody doing something for somebody else, but finding ways that we can become partners. And in the partnerships of service, more stories are created, more service is inspired, and that whole cycle of stories and service, I think, is one of the great lessons we learn coming out of the Rwandan genocide. Thanks.